Today, I want to talk about a story in the scripture from John chapter 11, verses 1 through 44, the death of Lazarus. And I'm not going to read the story because of the length, but if you're not familiar with it, you can look it up. Again, it's in John 11, verses 1 through 44. You can find that online very, very easily. And I want to give you just basically a summary of the story. A friend of Jesus's, Lazarus, who is the brother of Mary and Martha, also friends of Jesus, dies. And word gets to him that this friend, this one he loves, as the scripture says, has passed away. And Jesus goes, but he waits days to go to the home of Mary and Martha as they grieve the loss of their brother. And understand this was Jesus's friend, which is a significant thing. It's an interesting part of the story. And as he approaches the home, he encounters both Mary and Martha separately, and both of them say the same thing to him in words that maybe don't seem significant at the time, but if you think about the tone, if you think about grief, they are in fact significant. The truth is that when we are grieving, we often hurt others. That hurt people. And so Mary and Martha both come to Jesus and say, if you had been here, this wouldn't have happened. Really what each of them are saying to Jesus in their own way is, you don't care. Or perhaps, better yet, Jesus, why don't you care? And when we're in the midst of pain and suffering, that is what we often feel. God, don't you care? God, why are you allowing this to happen? Jesus, don't you love me? Jesus, why me? This is normal. This is natural. It's important to express these feelings. They're not a surprise to God. These are feelings that God has given us. At the same time, we can't stay there. So these sisters, rightly so, grieving, they're upset, they're hurt, they're frustrated. They feel that Jesus could have done something to stop this. And so they say, if you had been here. And what they're really saying is, Jesus, don't you care? Why don't you care? Jesus waited to come. That's interesting because if I think about it, if I were to have a friend pass away, I would do everything I could to get there. But Jesus knew better. Jesus sees what's happening in eternity. Jesus sees what's happening in the kingdom. Jesus sees backstage. We can't see backstage. Mary and Martha can't see backstage. And so as Jesus hears about Lazarus, we see the shortest verse in the entire Bible. Jesus wept. It's the shortest verse in the Bible, which is significant, but what's really significant is this idea that Jesus weeps for the death of a friend. Why is that significant? I mean, it seems normal and natural that if somebody were to pass, especially a friend, that we would weep. It's significant to understand that Jesus grieved, that Jesus felt sadness, that Jesus expressed this emotion. In fact, we know of at least 2 times where Jesus weeps. Jesus weeps here at the death of his friend Lazarus. Jesus weeps over the city of Jerusalem. What this reveals to us that's so important is that Jesus cares about our suffering. Jesus cares about our pain. That when we hurt, Jesus hurts. That when we weep, Jesus weeps for us. When we feel pain and suffering, Jesus feels that as well. In fact, maybe even more profoundly so. Think of it if you're a parent. As a parent, the most painful thing that I experience is when my kids are hurting. The hardest thing for me as a parent is when my kids are hurting and I can't stop it. I can't fix it. I can't make it go away. Or maybe even when I could, but I know that I shouldn't. That when we hurt, Jesus hurts. That we are God's beloved children. Pain and suffering, they're awful. And a lot of people are experiencing that now, whether the uncertainty or the physical pain of disease or the economic pain that comes with this pandemic. So many of us, in one way or another, are experiencing pain and suffering. When we hurt, God hurts. Pain is the rent we pay for being human. It's a reality of this life. It's the rent we pay for being human. And so often, one of the first things that I experience, one of the first things that I think, that we think when we are hurting, that when we are suffering, when something awful happens to us or in the world, God, why? Jesus, don't you care? Jesus, if you only had stopped this. And Jesus says, I weep for you. You see, we have this promise of resurrection. That's what happens in the Lazarus story. Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. Jesus points Mary and Martha and others to the promise of the resurrection. That as we come to Easter, a very different Easter for most of us, as the vast majority of us will not be able to physically be in the church for Easter, which is not easy. The Easter story is the promise of resurrection. But the story of resurrection isn't really that meaningful without Good Friday. That resurrection doesn't mean much without death. And in this season of COVID-19, in this season of isolation, it's an opportunity to let those things that draw us away from God die in us. To let idols, the things that we worship, even some of them good things, like being able to physically go to church on Easter, like being able to go to the grocery store, like knowing that there'll be toilet paper, like knowing that we'll have an income, these things that worship that may die, that perhaps are dying, and to know the hope of resurrection, to know that death is never the end of the story, to know that pain and suffering is never the end of the story, that God has more for us. Jesus has more for us, and we cannot see it. And God's timing is difficult. My best friend's dad once said to me that God often doesn't answer our prayers until 11:59. And I've never forgotten that. Truth is, years later, I came to realize that God often doesn't answer our prayers until 12:01, that God and I have never, not once have we ever agreed on timing. But death, pain, suffering, they are not the end of the story. Jesus has more for us. We can't see it. In the midst of this season, God is moving in you, God is moving in the church, and God is moving in the world. My favorite verse, my life verse, my theme verse comes from the minor prophet, Habakkuk or Habakkuk, however you want to say it. Nobody really knows anyway. Chapter 1, verse 5, and it says, "Look at the nations and watch, and be prepared to be utterly amazed. For I'm going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told." You see, the prophet, he was mad that the world was a mess. He was mad that God was allowing all this evil and suffering. Sound familiar? He was frustrated by the condition of the world. He couldn't see any hope. And God offers each of us this promise. The prophet recognizes this promise, offers these words to us. If Jesus can raise Lazarus from the dead, if Jesus himself can raise from the dead, he can bring us through anything. That we are a people of hope, of resurrection. Know that in your suffering, God is with you. Know that in your suffering, Jesus weeps. But know that resurrection is coming.